Hey guys, it's Bwengi and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the Lotter family murders, and I just want to warn you guys that this video is going to be really long and we're going to be diving into, we're really going to be getting into a lot of details. So grab a snack, grab a drink, and let's hang out. As always, before I get into the video, I have to make my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anybody that I'm going to be talking about in this video and all the families that were and are affected by this case. This video is purely for educational purposes and all the information was gotten off the internet and simply put together into one video. I apologize if I say anything offensive to anyone at any point in my video because that is not the intention at all. And with that being said, let's just get right into it. Maria Magdalena van der Merwe was born into a traditional and religious farming Afrikaans family as one of the many other Maria Magdalenas in the family. Because there were many Maria Magdalenas, her friends and family referred to her as Ricky so as to, distinguish her from the many other people who shared a name with her. Growing up, her mother used to do some odd stuff that were kind of hard to understand. Like one time she sold the family furniture because she was craving some donuts, but they would later come to understand her behavior as she was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. Ricky went to the University of Potchefstroom to study teaching, and while she was there she would struggle a lot with maths. She really needed help, so she decided to take some extra lessons, and this is where she would meet Johannes Lotter. Johnny was 3 years older than her. He was an engineering student and was really good in math. He offered extra lessons to other students who were struggling, and Ricky was one of them. Soon after they started with their extra lessons, they started dating, and their relationship would go on for a year before they decided to get married in 1981. On the 15th of April 1982, the couple had their first child, a baby girl that they named Nicolette Lotter, and they were both still studying at the time. Their marriage was proven to be very difficult as they were studying and working at the same time just to make ends meet and to provide for their daughter. After Johnny graduated, he was offered a job somewhere in the Eastern Cape, and so the entire family relocated from Northwest all the way to the Eastern Cape. And while they were there, they had 2 more children. In 1986, they had their second daughter, Christelle, and in 1988, they had their first and last son, Hardus. Shortly after Hardus was born, Johnny was offered another job by a German company in Durban, so yet again, the family had to relocate. The whole Lotter family was religious. Nicolette was part of the youth group in church, and that's where she got to make a couple of friends. She also got into a sexual relationship with a young man at the church when she was just 14, and most of her relationships from that point going forward were abusive and controlling, and she felt as though having sex with these people was the only thing that proved that the relationship was built on love. Although her parents knew that she was dating, they had no idea that she was having sex, and they believed that their daughter was saving herself for marriage. 2 years later, when Nicolette was just 16, she discovered that her father was having an affair. She told her mother about it, and even though she was devastated, Ricky decided to stay with her man. But she knew that she couldn't fully rely on him anymore, so she decided to go back to working as a teacher. And although they did stay together, their marriage was never really the same. Johnny also became a heavy drinker as a result of this unhappiness. Growing up, Nikki suffered from paranormal delusions, and her mother believed that these delusions were feeding off of the stories that she would hear whenever she visited her grandmother. So whenever she visited her grandmother, she would always hear stories about witches, demons, and tokoloshis, and of course this would feed into her delusions, the delusions that she was having. After matriculating, Nikki went to a music college in Durban, and because she was still in the same city, she didn't move out of home. It was during this time that Nicolette met a couple of people that encouraged her to become strongly religious again, and so she promised herself that she would stay celibate until she got married or found her husband. Although her delusions had lessened, soon after becoming strongly religious again, they returned, and this time they were quite strong. Her family's domestic worker, who had worked for them for years, had just passed on, so her parents hired a new helper, and Nikki disliked her from the bat. The lady's son was a traditional healer, and she also attended the Zion church, so Nikki was just convinced that this lady was casting curses on her family, and that's why her family was so unhappy. She wanted to get her fired, but when she told her parents about the curse, they just told her that she was being ridiculous and refused to fire her. And there was so much tension and hate between Nikki and their helper that the helper also started picking at her and doing stuff to antagonize her. She would find dead birds and she would put them underneath Nikki's bedroom window, and when Nikki found those dead birds, she was just convinced that this woman was cursing her. She would fast for very long periods of time, and when her hair started falling off as a result of that, Nikki was just convinced that the demons were pulling her hair out. When she found frogs that had been run over by cars, she would also believe that it was the curse or the demons, and when she found the same things in her neighbors' yards, she would believe that her neighbors' domestic workers were working with her domestic worker, and they were all placing curses on the people in their community. When her pastor rented out the premises to the Zion church, Nikki was furious. She asked her pastor to have them removed, and when he refused, she simply left and never returned. When her sister Christelle matriculated, she decided to go to Stellenbosch University. Their parents then bought a holiday home in the Western Cape, and they decided that they would all go there during the holidays to spend the holidays together as a family. Hardus was a quiet boy. He spent most of his time on his computer playing games or doing whatever on his computer, and he barely had any friends. The little friends that he had shared the same interests as him, which was mainly gaming. When Nikki turned 21, her parents bought her a car. She had just started a jazz band, so she really needed the car to get to her gigs and to also get to her waitressing job. Every single bad thing that would happen in their lives, Nikki would blame it on the curse, and she grew more and more frustrated as no one believed her and no one would listen to her. She just wanted someone to listen, and so she was happy when she found someone who would in February of 2007. She met a woman in Phoenix who apparently performed exorcisms, and the two set up a meeting. The day that Nikki went to her house, Velda told her that she believed her. She told her that she could help her get rid of the curse, but of course she had a price. She told Nikki that before they get to work, they needed to have lunch first. So Velda, her daughter, and Nikki all got into Nikki's car and they went to the nearby supermarket, and Nikki bought them groceries. When they got back, Velda burned some incense and she started dancing and chanting around Nikki, and this was her performing the ritual. She then tells Nikki that it will take some time before the exorcism is complete and that the next time she has to sleep over. Nikki already felt so light and she couldn't wait for the next session, which was going to be held the following weekend. Come the following weekend, Nikki heads out to Venla's house for the second exorcism. She buys the family some KFC for dinner and they all sit around the table and enjoy the food. During dinner, there was a knock at the door and a big boned young man walked into the room with a bunch of flowers. He handed Nikki the flowers and then went down on one knee and asked her to marry him. But get this, Nikki had actually never seen this young man before in her life. It turns out that he, Matthew Naidoo, was a neighbor of the family. After Nikki's last visit, Venla's daughter's husband went over to Matthew and told him about a young, rich and pretty girl who had come to have an exorcism performed on her, and Matthew just wanted to meet her. Matthew Naidoo was 20 years old. His father had left his mother when he was just 2 years old and he never returned. Matthew had a learning disorder and he had to drop out of school, but his uncle helped him find a job at a clothing store. This job was the bare minimum. He worked about 6 days a week for just about 290 rands after working 6 days a week. He didn't like the life that he was living, and he believed that he actually deserved more. So when he heard about this rich, pretty girl who had her own car, he just knew that he wanted to live like her. He also admired pastors. He knew certain Bible verses off by heart, and he felt like he would make a great religious leader. But most importantly, he admired the respect that these religious leaders got from their followers or from their community members, and he wanted some of that respect. Nikki rejects his proposal because this was their first encounter, but even though he had just been rejected, he decides to stay for dinner anyway. The following morning, Nikki wanted to leave before Matthew came back, but as soon as she got to her car outside, Matthew was there. He tried to make some conversation with her, but Nikki quickly got into her car and drove away. Later that day, Nikki receives an SMS from an unknown number. The person on the other end tells her that it's Matthew and that he just wanted to check up on her because she seemed a little bit sad earlier on. So Nikki starts thinking that it's sweet of him to check up on her even after she had brushed him off earlier on, and so she texts him back. Pretty soon the two start flirting over text messages, and they even make plans to see each other again. After their first hangouts, they start meeting up more frequently, going out at the mall, and Nikki understood that she had more money than Matthew, so she didn't mind paying whenever they ate out. She also understood that she had to fetch him and drop him off, and she didn't mind. Pretty soon though, Matthew thinks that it's time for him to bring up the topic about spirituality and religion. Nikki was really amazed by how much Matthew knew about the Bible, but Matthew did not just stop there. He went as far as telling Nikki that he is the third son of God and that he knows things about people that nobody else knows. He then tells Nikki about her demons, her hair falling out, and some stuff that she has been experiencing back at home, and Nikki is absolutely sold. She hadn't told him about any of these things, so hearing him say them or talk about them just proved to her that he was indeed the third son of God. But of course, Matthew could have heard these things from his neighbors who were performing exorcisms on Nikki. Matthew also tells Nikki that he has healing powers, and because Nikki has been feeling a lot happier around him, she believes that Matthew has been healing her. She also broke her celibacy promise to herself and started having sex with Matthew pretty soon after getting this information, because she truly believed that this was the man that God wanted her to marry. She also started bringing Matthew home with her, and even though she had introduced him as her friend, her parents soon found out that there was more to their relationship than just a friendship. Ricky was nice to Matthew, but Johnny didn't really go out of his way to make conversation with him. They told the two that Matthew was not allowed to sleep over, so Nikki had to drive Matthew back to Phoenix every single night. Matthew's story just keeps getting crazier and crazier. He just keeps taking it up a notch every single time. He later tells Nikki that he, the third son of God, was sent to this earth to fulfill a very holy mission, but he couldn't tell Nikki what that mission was. He could already tell that he had his claws in her, and so soon he started physically abusing her as well. The first time Matthew laid a hand on Nikki, he was not happy with the way Nikki had greeted her ex, and Nikki believed that it was her fault, and so she apologized to Matthew for, I guess, provoking him. Matthew does not apologize though. Instead, he tells her that it wasn't him that hit her. It was one of the spirits that lived inside of him. He said that 3 parts to him, and one of those parts was very violent and evil, and it wanted to derail him or take him off of his holy path. And each of these 3 parts had different voices. Soon after this, Matthew started complaining about his job and about going back home after spending each evening with the Lotters. Nikki then suggests that he moves in with them. She knew that her parents wouldn't be pleased with this, So she tells Matthew that he can live in her room and he would only be able to leave her room when her parents were at work. In the evenings when they saw him, they would just think that he was visiting as usual. She also told Matthew that he can quit his job and start working as a manager for her jazz band, and Matthew is thrilled. But he says that he doesn't like the fact that he's always gonna have to ask Nikki for some money, so Nikki gives him her bank card and her PIN to make him feel better. Pretty soon, Matthew had moved in, and almost immediately after moving in, the abuse got worse. He not only physically abuses her now, he also starts sexually assaulting her as well, and he claims that his abuse is punishment for Nikki's sins. He would also sprawl over Nikki's single bed. Already Matthew was a big person, so he would sprawl over Nikki's bed and leave her with no other choice but to sleep on the floor. Matthew also tells Nikki how much he hates animals, and pretty soon after moving in, Nikki's beloved cat goes missing. Its dead body was found in the neighbor's yard. The family dog was also beaten to a pulp, but thankfully it survived the beating. He also started reading Nikki's diaries in secret, and he would tell her the things that he read, making it seem like it was one of those things that he knew about people, when all he did was literally go through Nikki's diaries, old diaries and her current diary. Yeah, he was pretty sick. The band also stopped getting booked as soon as Matthew became the manager. One time as the band was performing, Matthew got on stage and started telling dirty jokes and sexual jokes, and after their performance, the manager actually told the band to never come back. Nikki's younger brother soon found out about the live-in situation, but because he liked Matthew, he never told on them, and the parents never noticed a thing. I don't understand how they never noticed that there was someone else living in their house. To his mom, Matthew said that he had found a job in London, and he said this to avoid frequent visits. And to Mr. and Mrs. Lotter, he said that he was a marketing manager for a clothing brand. By August of 2007, he had convinced Nikki that her parents were evil messengers and that all they wanted to do was control Nikki's life. Pretty soon, the two of them had managed to convince Hardus that Matthew was actually the third son of God. And even though Hardus was a little bit skeptical at first, it didn't take long for him to be just as invested as his sister was. Matthew then convinces the two of them that God showed him that their parents had abused them while they were young, and the two of them just eat up every single lie that comes out of Matthew's mouth. He also starts physically assaulting Hardus as punishment for his sins. Because the band had stopped getting gigs and Nikki was now working for two, she started working long hours at the bar, and Matthew grew extremely jealous. He would hang out at the bar that Nikki worked at, and he would also get very aggressive with male customers. In November of 2007, the pub owner put up a policy that prohibited family members and partners of employees from hanging around the bar. Matthew saw this, but he absolutely ignored it, and he would still come to work, hang around, and be aggressive towards male customers. And as a result, Nikki was fired. She got a job at a coffee shop pretty soon after getting fired though. In December, the family wanted to go to their holiday home in Western Cape, but Nikki couldn't go because she had just started at her new workplace. Hardus was really excited to go, but Matthew told him that he couldn't be alone with his evil parents, and so Hardus told his parents that he couldn't go. During their time alone in December, Matthew introduces to them the idea of killing Mr. and Mrs. Lotter. He had actually went through their documents and insurance policies, and he had seen that he stood a chance to make a really large amount of money if Mr. and Mrs. Lotter were to die. But to the siblings, he tells them that their parents are evil, and God says that they have to die in order for them to complete their holy mission. They were already so deep into Matthew's world that they accepted the idea and started planning. When Ricky and Johnny came back home on the 18th of January 2008, Matthew was really angry and annoyed at the fact that he had to go hide again. He starts taking his frustrations out on Nikki again. He would physically abuse her and would demand sex all night long. So Nikki wouldn't get enough sleep. She would always be late for work, and so her boss just got tired of it and fired her. Since they were now struggling to make money, they had to come up with a new way of making money. So Matthew comes up with an idea of scamming Mr. Lotter. They first took out 2,000 rand from his bank card, and Mr. Lotter was confused. He changed his PIN, but it happened again. So this time he decided to go to the bank and get a new bank card. And when it happened again, he headed to the police and opened a case. The police checked the CCTV footage at the ATM, and the person who was withdrawing the money was wearing a balaclava, so they couldn't see his face. But Mr. Lotter thought that the sweater that this man was wearing looked quite familiar. He also saw his daughter's car in the background of the footage, so he decided not to open a case. He went back home and confronts all of them, but they tell him that it was just a coincidence. Matthew then gives Hardus the sweater and tells him to hide it in his room. They knew their parents were suspicious of them though, so Matthew came up with a new plan to throw them off track. He tells Hardus to steal his mother's handbag while his mother is sleeping, steal her phone, and then dump the handbag at some shady neighborhood. And Hardus goes through with the plan. Ricky was absolutely terrified because she knew that her handbag was in the house when she went to sleep, but for some reason it was found at some shady neighborhood. So she believed that someone was in the house with them, stole the bag, and went back to the neighborhood. She did not suspect her children or Matthew. Matthew then started sending some threatening messages to Mr. Lotter using a burner phone, and he also wrote a couple of letters and dropping them off at the doorstep. Mr. and Mrs. Lotter then went to the police to report the matter. They were very shaken by the letters, but they were also quite suspicious of Matthew. They did a background check on him and found out that he had lied about everything, his education and his job. So they knew they couldn't trust him, and they just wanted him out of their lives. They asked Detective Duma to accompany them to their home to witness the confrontation, and he agrees. He is there when Mr. and Mrs. Lotter confront Matthew. They confront Matthew and then tell him to never set foot in their house again. But Nicolette tells them that if Matthew goes, she leaves with him. And although they didn't want their daughter to leave, they really wanted Matthew out of their house, so Nicolette left with him. Ricky and Johnny kept trying to get Nikki back home though, and they even sent Hardus out to go talk to her, and he went over to the boarding house that the two had rented together. The three of them came up with a plan that Nikki would agree to go back home, and then in a couple of days Matthew would secretly move back in again. They went through with the plan, and in just a matter of days they were all together again. The topic of killing Mr. and Mrs. Lotter came back into play again, and this time they knew that they had to do it soon. The plan was to kill Johnny first and then make it look like a natural death, and then they would wait a bit and kill Ricky about a month after Johnny's death and also make it look like a natural death. Their first plan was to put pure alcohol into Johnny's whiskey, and then he would hopefully die from alcohol poisoning. This plan doesn't work though, because Johnny just seems to fall asleep quickly. He doesn't actually die. So now they have to come up with a second plan, which was to put some sap from a poisonous plant inside his alcohol again and hopefully get him to die. But this one also doesn't work because Johnny immediately notices some white substance settling at the bottom of the bottle, and he throws out the whole bottle without even drinking it. And now they had to come up with a third plan. Matthew tells them that he will do the killing. He will inject both their parents with a syringe filled with air, and all the siblings had to do was basically restrict their mother or hold her down while he was killing the father, and then he would then move on to killing their mother. Come the 19th of July 2008, the trio was ready to kill Mr. and Mrs. Lotter. Matthew sold Hardus's camera and they bought a taser gun, some needles, and some latex gloves. He also bought movie tickets for himself and Nicolette, as they would need an alibi. The plan was for Hardus to zap Ricky with the taser gun and then pin her or hold her down as Nikki got in the car, drove to the mall, and fetched Matthew, who would then come and kill her, and then they would do the same with Johnny. Later that night, Nikki dropped Matthew off at the mall and then drove back home. Her father was already asleep at the time, but Ricky wasn't. So Nikki approached her mother and asked her if she would like to join her in the kitchen for some tea, which she did. Hardus approached his mother from the back, put the taser gun on her neck, and then tried to zap her, but it only let out a small spark and didn't really do anything. So he wrapped his arm around her neck and started tightening, and as soon as Ricky realized what was happening, she put on a fight. Nikki realized that her brother and mother were struggling, so she got up and helped her brother. She starts punching Ricky in the face multiple times until she finally stops moving, and then she calls Matthew to tell him that he needs to come home as the plan had changed. Nikki then drives out to the mall to fetch Matthew, and when he arrives and sees the state that Ricky is in, he is furious. He tells Nicolette that this is her fault, therefore she has to fix it. He hands her the syringes and tells her that she now has to kill her mother because she's the one that messed up the plan. Nikki is nervous, but she keeps trying to inject her mother, but she keeps failing. So she goes over to Matthew and gives him an update, and Matthew simply hands her a knife. Before Nikki could do anything, Ricky woke up, looked at her children, and told them that she loved them. Mercilessly, Nikki stabbed her 11 times. Once Ricky had died, Matthew gave Nikki a plastic bag, told her to put the clothes in, and then told her to go get cleaned up. He tells Hardus that God is angry at them for messing up the plan, and he also tells him that since Nikki had killed their mother, he now had to kill their father. Matthew also tells him that God says that if he wants to repent, he must hang himself after killing his father. Hardus was scared, but he understood that that's what God wanted him to do. He then forces him to write a suicide note explaining that he killed his parents. He and Nikki then head off to the mall to strengthen their alibi. They arrive at the mall at around 10 p.m. and they started walking around to make sure that the cameras captured them. And Matthew also causes a scene at the ice cream shop to make sure that the person who was stabbing them remembers him. Back at home, Hardus made a cord and headed to his parents' room. He put the cord around Johnny's neck one time, and before he could tighten it, Johnny got up. He punched Hardus and the two started fighting and fighting and fighting. They got off the bed and continued fighting. At some point, Johnny managed to make it out of the room, but unfortunately, before he could even make it to the front door, Hardus caught up to him, sat on top of him, and then strangled him to death. Then after killing his father, he realized that he wasn't going to be able to kill himself, so he called his sister. When the two realized that Hardus wasn't going to kill himself, they got into the car and headed back home. Matthew instructs them to cover the bodies up with sheets while he comes up with a new strategy. He then made the murders look like a targeted attack by the people who had been sending threatening messages to the family. He tells Nicolette that the story that she's going to give the police is that when she came back home, she found both her parents dead and her brother tied up in her room. He then goes on to type a letter that is from the alleged attackers, and he addresses it to the police. Nikki then drops Matthew at a taxi rank and then heads back home. At around 2 a.m. she calls Matthew, and this was supposed to be her coming home to find her parents murdered. After receiving the call, Matthew made his way to the police station. On his way there, he called his mother to let her know that Nikki's parents had died. He arrives at the police station and reports the crime. 2 police officers take his statement and then they get in the car with him and head over to the crime scene. While waiting for the police, Nikki and Hardus go over their story again to make sure that their stories corroborate, and then Nikki goes to the kitchen and rubs some onions under her eyes to try and get the tears to flow, but nothing works. When the police get there, Hardus is in shock and cannot speak, while Nikki is hysterical. Upon seeing the bodies and the state that the crime scene was in, the constables decide to just call Detective Duma, who just knew by looking at the address that he had been there before. He was there when Mr. and Mrs. Lotter banned Matthew from their house, and so when he arrived there, he was kind of shocked to see Matthew there. He also called the organized crime unit after finding out that the attackers could be the same people that sent the threatening messages. The investigators then tell Matthew and the siblings that they were gonna have to leave the house as it was an active crime scene, and Matthew flips out. This was the one thing that he actually hadn't planned, because he thought that the police were just gonna get in the house, take the bodies, ask them a couple of questions, and then leave. So he starts thinking about what could be in the house that could possibly be incriminating, and instantly he thinks about his diary. So he asks the police if they could allow him to go into Nikki's bedroom to fetch a jacket for himself and Nikki because it was cold outside, and they allowed him to. While he was there, he took a jacket for himself and Nikki, and then he smuggled his diary out. When the pathologists arrived at the scene, they discovered that Mrs. Lotter had died at least 2 hours before Mr. Lotter, and this instantly made the trio's story questionable. They were then taken to Westville Police Station in 3 separate vehicles. Detectives also got a hold of Nikki's diary, and after reading it, they wanted toxicology reports on her because they just thought that she could be on some drugs, but that was ruled out by the toxicology report. The police were buying themselves some time. They were already convinced that these 3 were responsible for the murders, but they wanted to keep them around for enough time for them to collect enough evidence to arrest them. A few hours later, they were moved from the Westville Police Station to the Organized Crime Unit, where they were placed under arrest for the murders of Mr. and Mrs. Lotter. Their cell phones were also seized to go through their cell phone records. Nikki was given a phone and told to inform her family of what had happened. She called her grandmother, and upon hearing the news, her grandmother had a heart attack that instantly took her life. They were each placed in different rooms for questioning. The police told Matthew that they knew that his alibi was a lie because there were phone calls between himself and Nikki during the time that they were supposed to be watching a movie. And immediately after hearing this, Matthew changed his story. He told the police that he knew that the siblings hated their parents because their parents had abused them, but he knows absolutely nothing regarding the murder. They then asked him where he lived, and Matthew said that he lived with his mother, but they also knew that this was a lie because they had spoken to his mother already. When they told him that they knew, Matthew started confessing to everything, and he was so arrogant about it, and it seems as though he was feeding off of the attention that he was getting, and with everybody that entered the room, his voice was animated, he was getting louder and louder. He actually enjoyed the attention that he was getting. Hardus was still sticking to the story that they had come up with, but that all changed when the detective that was talking to him took him to go listen to Matthew spilling all the beans. It's as if he had a light bulb moment and decided to speak. He gave the police a long handwritten statement, and he told the police everything. How Matthew had told them that he's the 3rd son of God, how he had brainwashed them, how he had convinced them that killing their parents was part of some holy mission. He also told the cops about the diary that Matthew had smuggled out of the house and where they could find it. Nikki, on the other hand, just kept on asking to speak to Matthew. The police already kind of knew the situation, so they were patient with her. One detective was able to connect with Nikki over the Bible, or through the Bible. They spoke about religion, the Bible, God, and Nikki just felt like they connected so much that she told him about Matthew being the 3rd son of God. The detective then asks Nikki to give her just one scripture where Jesus goes around telling everybody that he's the son of God and just rubbing it in everyone's faces. And when Nikki can't give him the scripture, he tells her that there is no way that Matthew can be the son of God, because he is so cocky about it and he keeps rubbing it in everyone's faces, and he literally did nothing good in all the months that they have known him. A pastor also comes and explains to Nikki what a cult is and how brainwashing works and manipulation works, and then also explains to Nikki that she and her brother were part of a cult without knowing. Nikki understands this, and it's only a matter of time before she starts speaking. She also gives a long and very detailed statement that corroborated with Hardus's statement. Now the two siblings know that the murders were not part of any holy mission and that they were duped. The trial started in 2012 and they all pleaded not guilty to the murders. Nikki and Hardus's defense was basically that they were so brainwashed and controlled that they had absolutely no idea what they were doing. But Matthew now claims that he had no part to play at all in the murders. But of course the judge sees right through him. The judge also agreed that the siblings were brainwashed, manipulated, and controlled, but he also says that that does not take away the fact that they need to take responsibility for the part that they played in the murders, and they were all found guilty of the murders of Mr. and Mrs. Lotter. Hardus Lotter was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Nicolette Lotter was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment, while Matthew Naidoo was handed 2 life sentences. In March of 2018, Hardus was released from prison and would spend the rest of his sentence under house arrest. He moved in with a priest that he met whilst still in prison. Nicolette got married in November of 2018 while still in prison to a man that saw him on TV and instantly fell in love with her. She was also released in 2020. Matthew's mother is still very supportive of him, but as far as I know, the Lotters have completely cut out Nicolette and her brother, rightfully so. I can only imagine how Christelle felt after hearing the news. Thank you so much for watching today's case. Let me know what you think about it in the comments down below, and if you have any other case suggestions, drop them in the comment section. I always read them and I deliver. If you enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy this one as well. You could also subscribe to my channel while you're at it, because there's plenty more where this came from. Thank you once again for watching this video. I'll see you next time. Bye.